So, it happened during the winter of 1982 in a remote settlement called San Malama, tucked into the frozen northern wilderness. I had just turned 23 and was staying with my grandparents to earn my one-year work record, a necessity if I wanted a shot at a prestigious university back in the city. San Malama was nothing like the life I knew. No bustling streets, no cafes, and certainly no public transport. Here, town crawled marked only by the rhythm of nature and the hum of survival. The village was a patchwork of log cabins and barracks, surrounded by an endless sea of taiga and tundra. Roads, when they existed, were mere suggestions carved into the snow. Snowmobiles and sleds were the lifelines connecting one cluster of humanity to another. People lived simply, unhurriedly, and the harsh environment seemed to whittle away any unnecessary complexities of character. It wasn't long before I found a job in a small tailoring workshop on the outskirts of a settlement. The workshop, a cramped and drafty wooden hut, was run by local women who sewed for coats and boots from reindeer hides brought in by herders. Among the women was Seema, the senior seamstress, a stout and Guinnessson woman with a face round as the moon and slanted eyes that seemed to peer straight for you. Everyone called her Seema, but her real name, Sumyaku, carried a weight of authority I didn't fully understand at the time. The Guinnessson people, or Naya, as they called themselves, had their own unique beliefs. They whispered of spirits that roamed the taiga, restless, malevolent entities that thrived on fear and misfortune. According to them, the land was fretted with invisible pathways that spirits used to traverse their world and ours. To the uninitiated, these tales might seem quaint or absurd, but in San Malama, they carried the gravity of lives and deaths. One particular evening in late December, I found myself working late alongside Seema and a few others. Outside, the northern night pressed against the frosted windows like a living thing, sick and impenetrable. The women chattered softly in their native language, occasionally breaking into laughter, but their voices were tinged with unease. "You should stay a while, Kristen," Seema said in her lilting accent, her gaze steady and oddly serious. "The weather is wicked tonight." I glanced outside. It was cold, sure, but the stars twinkled above like tiny shards of ice, and the wind barely stirred the snow. "It looks fine to me," I replied, pulling on my sick fur coat. "Looks deceive," Seema said. "The barmig is restless tonight." "The barmit?" I asked, the name sending an involuntary shiver down my spine. Seema nodded solemnly. "A spirit, a trickster. It whispers to travelers, luring them into the cold until they sleep and never wake. If you go, don't stop. Don't rest. And no matter what you hear, don't listen." The other women exchanged uneasy glances, but said nothing. "I'll be fine," I assured them, forcing a smile. "It's only a short walk." Seema's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said no more. The snow crunched underfoot as I set out toward my grandparents' home, a faint glow in the distance marking the edge of the village. The air was sharp and still, and the world around me was hushed, as if holding its breath. Then the wind came. It began as a low moan, rising to a wailing crescendo that seemed to come from every direction at once. Snow swirled around me, thick and blinding, erasing the path ahead. My heart pounded as I realized I had lost all sense of direction. "Just keep moving," I muttered to myself, clutching my coat tighter. But the wind wasn't just wind. It carried a voice, soft, insidious, and impossible to ignore. "Rest, child," it whispered. "You're so tired. Just lie down. It's warm in the snow." "Yeah," I shouted, the sound swallowed instantly by the storm. I pressed on, but the voice grew louder, more insistent. Shadows flitted at the edges of my vision, and icy tendrils seemed to pull at my feet. Seema's warning echoed in my mind. "Don't stop. Don't listen." After what felt like hours of trudging through knee-deep drifts, my strength began to wane. I stumbled, falling face first into the snow. The voice was there, cooing gently. "Sleep now. You've done enough." "No," I screamed, tears freezing on my cheeks. My hands brushed against something solid, a massive insulated pipe. The village's heating main. If I could crawl beneath it, I'd be inside the settlement's perimeter. Clawing at the snow, I dug a shallow trench and wriggled under the pipe, the voice screaming in protest. On the other side, the wind suddenly ceased. The world was still again, as if the storm had never existed. Staggering to my feet, I saw the distant glow of the radio tower's beacon. Guided by its light, I stumbled home. When I told my story the next day, the workshop erupted in murmurs of fear and disbelief. The Naya women shook their heads and crossed themselves, muttering prayers under their breath. "You were lucky," Seema said, her tone both scolding and relieved. "The Barmak rarely lets anyone go." From that day on, I never walked alone at night, no matter how late the others stayed to chat. And when the next blizzard rolled in, Seema led us home herself. Walking behind her that night, I saw something I'll never forget. Where Seema stepped, the snow and wind parted as if she carried an invisible shield. Her movements were rhythmic, almost like a dance, and for the first time I understood why the others revered her so. Seema wasn't just a seamstress, she was a bridge between worlds. And in San Malama, that could mean the difference between life and death. For weeks after that harrowing night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been marked. Something about the way Seema looked at me, a mixture of pity and quiet alarm, made my skin crawl. The Barmak, she said, never simply let someone go. If it couldn't play in your life, it would leave a part of itself behind, waiting for another chance. Life in San Malama returned to its monotonous rhythm, yet I felt like a thread out of place in a tightly woven fabric. The other villagers, especially the older ones, began to avoid me. A few whispered words I couldn't catch, their eyes darting to the edges of the forest when they thought I wasn't looking. Even my grandparents grew distant, though they tried to hide it behind thin smiles and busied hands. "Grandma, is something wrong?" I asked one evening as we sat near the crackling hearth. She hesitated, glancing at Grandpa, who was meticulously sharpening his axe by the firelight. Finally, she sighed. "You shouldn't have walked alone that night, Kristen. There are things here, things we don't understand. Seema says you need to be cleansed." "Cleansed? What does that mean?" "It's just a precaution," she said quickly, but the quaver in her voice betrayed her fear. 2 nights later, I was summoned to Seema's home. The women from the workshop were already there, their faces grim in the flickering candlelight. Seema had transformed her modest living room into what looked like a ceremonial space. Animal bones hung from the ceiling, and a pungent herbal smoke filled the air. "Sit," she commanded, gesturing to a wooden stool in the center of the room. I obeyed, though my stomach churned with unease. Seema began chanting in a language I couldn't understand, her voice low and rhythmic. She circled me, sprinkling a mixture of herbs and ash onto the floor. The other women joined in, their voices rising in a haunting harmony. At first, I felt ridiculous, like a child playing dress-up in an elaborate game of pretend. But as the chanting grew louder, the room seemed to warp around me. Shadows danced wildly on the walls, and the air grew thick and oppressive. And then I heard it, the voice. "Kristen," it whispered, faint but unmistakable. My heart seized. "Did you hear that?" I blurted, my voice cracking. Seema's chanting faltered, and she shot me a sharp look. "Do not speak," she barked, her voice cracking like a whip. The room grew colder, and the candles flickered as if caught in an invisible wind. The voice grew louder, more insistent. "You belong to me." "Enough!" Seema shouted, slamming a carved wooden staff onto the ground. The room fell silent. She looked at me, her face pale and slick with sweat. "It's not finished with you," she said gravely. "But it will be soon." The days that followed were fraught with unease. The villagers avoided me entirely now, crossing the street or pretending not to see me when I passed. My grandparents, though kinder, seemed to be on edge, their eyes constantly flitting to the windows. It wasn't long before Seema appeared on our doorstep with grim news. "The Barmak is hunting," she said, her voice low. "Another villager has gone missing. Yum Owen, the herder's son. He was last seen near the edge of the forest. Do you think it's connected to Kristen? Grandma asked hesitantly. Seema didn't answer directly, but her silence spoke volumes. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. The walls of the cabin felt suffocating, the air thick with unspoken fear. Around midnight, I decided to take a walk to clear my head, a decision I would come to regret. The village was eerily silent, the only sound the crunch of snow underfoot. I wandered toward the outskirts, where the forest loomed like a black wall against the night sky. A strange compulsion drew me closer, though I couldn't explain why. And then I saw it, a figure standing at the tree line. It was tall and impossibly thin, its outline blurred as if it were half-formed. Two glowing eyes stared at me, and though it had no mouth, I could feel it smile. Kristen, I stumbled backward, my breath hitching in my throat. The figure stepped closer, its movements unnaturally fluid. Come to me, it whispered, its voice like ice splintering in the wind. I turned and ran. The next morning, I told my grandparents everything. Grandpa's face darkened, and he muttered something under his breath before storming out of the cabin. Grandma looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. You've seen it, she whispered. The Barmig has claimed you. By midday, word had spread through the village. A council of elders was convened in the community hall, a gathering reserved for matters of utmost importance. Seema was there, along with the village leader, an elderly man named Foster. He was a stoic figure, his face weathered like ancient bark, but even he seemed unsettled. The Barmig's presence has grown stronger since Kristen's arrival, Foster said bluntly, his piercing eyes fixed on me. They must be dealt with before it claims more lives. And how do you propose we do that? Seema challenged, her tone sharp. Foster hesitated, glancing at the other elders. The girl must leave, he said finally. Seema snapped. Banishment will only anger it further. The Barmig feeds on fear and isolation. Sending her into the wilderness would be a death sentence, for her and for us. The room fell into a tense silence. Finally, Foster sighed. Then what do you suggest? Seema's gaze hardened. We confront it, together. That evening, a small group of villagers gathered at the edge of the forest, armed with torches, drums, and ancient talismans. Seema led the procession, her staff in hand, while I was placed at the center, surrounded by the others. If it calls to you, do not answer, Seema instructed me. We will face it as one. Remember, the Barmig is strongest in the mind. Do not let it break you. We entered the forest, the torches casting long, flickering shadows. The trees seemed to close in around us, and the air grew colder with every step. Then the wind came. It howled through the trees, carrying the now familiar voice. Kristen, why do you resist me? I clenched my fists, refusing to respond. The figure appeared again, this time emerging fully from the shadows. It was monstrous, its elongated limbs and glowing eyes radiating malice. The villagers began chanting, their voices rising in defiance. The Barmig let out a piercing scream, and the ground seemed to quake beneath us. I felt its icy tendrils clawing in my mind, trying to pull me under. But then Seema stepped forward, her voice ringing clear and strong. Begone, spirit, she commanded, striking the ground with her staff. You have no power here. The Barmig recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. The chanting grew louder, the villagers standing firm despite the storm of snow and wind. Finally, with a final, bone-chilling wail, the spirit dissolved into the night. The village was quiet the next day, the air heavy with release. The elders declared the Barmig vanquished, though Seema warned that it was merely weakened, not destroyed. As for me, I left Malma that spring, returning to the city and the life I had once known. But even now, years later, I can still hear its voice in my dreams. Kristen, leaving San Malma should have brought peace, but the Barmig wasn't content to remain a distant memory. Even in the city, far from snow-covered forests and whispering winds, I felt its presence. It began subtly, a chill that lingered in my apartment no matter how high I turned the heat. The faint sound of wailing carried on breezes that shouldn't have existed. At first, I convinced myself it was my imagination, a residue of trauma that needed time to heal. But then the dreams began. Every night, I found myself back in the forest, surrounded by towering, skeletal trees. The barmaid would be there, waiting, its glowing eyes fixed on me. It never moved, never spoke, but its presence was suffocating. I stopped sleeping well. My co-workers began commenting on how tired I looked, how distracted I seemed during meetings. The city was supposed to be my escape, my return to normalcy. But instead, it felt like the barmaid had followed me, infecting my life like a slow poison. One evening, as I sat staring blankly at my computer screen, a notification popped up. Incoming call, Grandma. My heart leaped. I hadn't spoken to her since leaving San Malma. I answered quickly. Grandma, is everything okay? There was a pause on the other end, then a familiar voice, soft, trembling. Kristen, it's back. Against my better judgment, I boarded the earliest train back to San Malma. The thought of returning to that place filled me with dread, but I couldn't abandon my grandparents, not when they needed me. When I arrived, the village felt different. The air was colder, sharper, and the streets were eerily quiet. Grandma met me at the station, her face pale and lined with worry. It's stronger this time, she said as we walked back to the cabin. Seema believes it's angry because we've forced it to retreat. What can we do? I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted the answer. She hesitated. There's another ritual, one we didn't attempt before. It's dangerous, but it might be the only way to banish it for good. The elders were reluctant to involve me again, but Seema insisted. The Barmagus marked her, she said, her voice firm. She's already part of this, whether we like it or not. Foster, the village leader, sighed heavily. The old texts speak of a sealing ritual, one that binds the spirit to its place of origin. But such rituals demand a great sacrifice. A murmur rippled through the realm. What kind of sacrifice? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Foster avoided my gaze. A bond must be formed, a tether that holds the spirit in place. The one who performs the ritual becomes that tether. The weight of his words sank in like stones. I glanced at Seema, hoping for an alternative, but her expression was grim. You mean someone has to stay with it? Forever? Foster nodded. To ensure it can never leave. Despite the ominous nature of the ritual, preparations began immediately. The villagers worked tirelessly, gathering the necessary items. Ancient runes carved from wood, bowls of herbs and hash, and a ceremonial dagger that glinted ominously in the firelight. We will perform the ritual at the old clearing, Seema explained. It's the closest place to the Barmig's origin point, the heart of the forest. I spent the day in a haze of dread, torn between the urge to flee and the growing sense of responsibility. My grandparents tried to comfort me, but their fear was palpable. As night fell, the villagers gathered at the edge of the forest, torches in hand. Seema led the way, her staff tapping against the frozen ground. The air was thick with tension, every shadow seeming to ripple with unseen movement. The clearing was eerily quiet, the trees forming a natural barrier around the open space. The ritual circle had been prepared, its edges marked with glowing symbols that pulsed faintly in the darkness. Seema gestured for me to step into the center. You must be the one to speak the incantation, she said. The Barmig is bound to you. Only you can seal it. My heart pounded as I took my place, clutching the ceremonial dagger tightly. The villagers formed a protective ring around the circle, their chanting low and rhythmic. The wind began to pick up, carrying with it the familiar, haunting wail. My breath caught as the Barmig emerged from the shadows, its form more defined than ever. It was taller now, its limbs stretching impossibly long, and its glowing eyes burned with fury. Kristen, its voice hissed, laced with venom. I struggled to steady my hands as Seema's voice guided me through the incantation. The words felt foreign on my tongue, their weight heavy and ancient. The Barmaid circled the edge of the ritual, its movements erratic and unnerving. "You cannot bind me," it snarled. "I am eternal." The chanting grew louder, the villagers' voices rising in unison. The symbols around the circle flared brightly, their light casting the Barmig shadow in sharp relief. As the incantation reached its climax, the Barmig lunged toward me, its form shattering the boundary of the circle. I stumbled backward, raising the dagger instinctively. The blade connected, not with flesh, but with something colder and harder than ice. The Barmig let out a piercing scream, and the world seemed to shatter around me. I felt myself being pulled into a void, the air ripped from my lungs. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness and cold, a sensation so profound it felt like my soul was being torn apart. And in silence, when I opened my eyes, I was lying in the center of the clearing. The villagers stood around me, their faces etched with awe and relief. "It's done," Seema said softly, her voice trembling. The Barmig was gone, its presence erased from the forest and the village. Life in San Malma slowly returned to normal, though the scars it left behind would linger for years to come. As for me, I left the village once more, this time with a sense of closure. But even now, I carry a part of that night with me, a faint, icy whisper that sometimes creeps into the edges of my dreams. Some marks, it seems, never truly fade,